So welcome again, everyone, to our Sunday Forum series as we make our way through the Old Testament Hebrew Scripture narratives. We've had some wonderful presentations so far, beginning with creation stories in Genesis, with the fall, the flood, the Abraham story, and now we're moving into the Jacob story, which is one of the very important stories out of Genesis. Really, it's a primal story in the sense that it tells us a lot about the beginnings of Israel. I do want to begin by saying at the outset that I am greatly indebted to Walter Brueggemann's commentary on Genesis, found in the Interpretation series. So I want to give credit where credit is due. Much of my presentation comes from his commentary. If you've not read any of Walter Brueggemann's commentaries and are interested in digging more into the Old Testament, I highly recommend him. He's a very good commentator because while he doesn't mind the technical piece and the critical piece of interpreting the Bible, he doesn't just leave it at that. He's also quite theological, which is something I like as well. And he says, and I'll begin with a quotation from him, "The narrative about Jacob portrays Israel in its earthiest and most scandalous appearance in Genesis." And I think that that's so true. If we think about the narratives of Jacob, these are not really pretty narratives. You know, these are not hero narratives by any stretch of the imagination. Many of you probably recall that I grew up Baptist, the very fundamentalist version of Baptist, and went to such a school. And while I was there for my undergraduate degree, I was involved in theater. And we did Shakespeare often. But because of this school's stance and worldview, they would edit large portions out of Shakespeare, and then the way they would interpret the play was very different than really, I think, most other people would interpret the play. And there were certain Shakespearean plays that I didn't really get until I watched them like at the Shakespeare Theater or something like that, and they'd be like, oh, that's what Shakespeare was saying there. You know, there's a humor and earthiness to Shakespeare that we can just kind of edit out if we want and just make it kind of all glorious and wonderful. But there's this earthiness and scandalousness to Shakespeare, and the same is true of Scripture. And when we're reading the Jacob story, don't read the Jacob story and put Jacob on this big pedestal as some lofty pillar. You're not going to get it if you do that, because you're going to be disappointed, frankly. I mean, from his conception, from in the womb, we see Jacob as someone who is in conflict, a constant conflict. And those are actually two themes that Brueggemann kind of teases out of the Jacob story. The first one is that Jacob is called by God outside the natural order of things. We'll talk about what that means in just a minute. But rather than being called by God in the normal way, in which one might be called by God, Jacob is called of God outside the natural order of things. Yet at the same time, even though he's called by God, Jacob's life is filled with conflict. From the womb until his death, his life is a life filled with conflict. There are some critical issues that are important to understand about the Jacob story so that you can place it in the right kind of context. It's important not to think of Genesis or the Jacob story in particular as being a book that was penned by Moses in one sitting. You know, that Moses just kind of sat down and wrote the whole thing, in one sitting. No, Genesis and the story of Jacob in particular were parts of stories and traditions that had been carried by the people of Israel over time as oral tradition, and then were brought together into a book. And then that book was edited, and it was edited, and it was edited. And in particular, the Jacob story, that's true of that as well. So you'll see at times things like, well, why are there two creation stories? Well, because they came from two different traditions and were placed in one book. And the same is true in the Jacob story as well. You'll see some things that just like, wait a minute, this doesn't quite seem to fit here. Well, that's because it probably was not part of an original tradition, but was part of a different tradition and got merged into one book. So that's an important thing to remember. Another important thing to remember about the Jacob tradition in particular is that it was written mostly for the northern kingdoms of Israel, with really no thought so much of Jerusalem, the southern kingdoms, the monarchy. So the northern kingdoms, they were kind of the rabble-rousers. You know, they were the ones that were kind of doing their own thing and quite happy to do so, thank you very much. And so that's important in terms of understanding Jacob and the Jacob story as well. I think I'm going to jump right in. Oops, someone took down that clock, so I'm going to use my watch here. I'm going to jump right into, on the handout that I provided for you, this is a diagram that Brueggemann offers. It is a chiasm. You can see it as a chiasm. If you look at conflict with Esau as A, meeting at Bethel as B, conflict with Laban as C, births as D, you have C prime, B prime, and A prime. So if you've been coming on Sundays to our forums, you're pretty used to chiasms by now. We saw chiasms in Genesis 1. We saw chiasms in Abraham, so it probably should be no surprise to us that we see a chiasm here in Jacob as well. And we're going to follow this kind of particular narrative, this literary approach here, starting with the conflict with Esau. So the conflict with Esau, of course, begins with the birth of Jacob. As I mentioned, it begins in the very womb. And we have an oracle that's given in Genesis 25:23, where Scripture says, "And the Lord said to her," being Rachel, "The one shall be stronger than the other, the elder shall serve the younger." And this oracle really kind of casts a shadow over the entire Jacob narrative, because we see this struggle between Jacob and Esau that begins in the womb really coloring everything that happens to this man and to his brother throughout the entire narrative. Now, also, this idea of the younger one is often associated with those who are the outcasts. It's important to remember that at this time, and it's really not even all that long ago that this was the case. I'm starting to watch the Netflix original, Crown, which is about Elizabeth II. Have you all seen that? You need to see that. As Anglicans, you just need to see it. It's a really good show. It's about the Queen Elizabeth, who is currently queen right now. And it starts with her early years right before the death of her father. And you see, so we can see it already, where this idea of inheritance, of royalty being passed on from either father or mother, in the case of queens, being passed on to the firstborn was important. And this stretches back thousands of years. And that was the case. So for this oracle to say that the secondborn, the younger one, was going to be greater than the elder, was really turning society up on its head. And it was quite a radical statement. And so we can see some associations with that, with Jesus' call also to take care of the orphans, the widows, who associated himself with publicans and sinners. So we see this narrative really of God associating God's self with those who are not necessarily the part of the natural order, stretching all the way back into the Genesis narratives. Now, Jacob's name also is important. Scholars debate about what it actually means. Some will say that it may mean heel, like the heel of your foot, and was the idea that he was kind of trying to kick himself out of the womb. So if you remember from the story, that the story tells us that Esau was grabbing onto the heel of Jacob, that one of the brothers was grabbing onto the heel of the other one. And so the idea that he was perhaps trying to kick himself out of the womb, but it can also mean supplanter. And the idea that he supplanted his elder brother and kind of took over for his elder brother. Then we have the story of Esau selling his birthright to Jacob, if you recall that particular story. And this touches upon some deep traditions that were part of the ancient Israel world. or pre-Israel, really, at this time, the ancient world at this time. The differences between shepherd and hunter. Esau kind of represented the hunter, the one who would still go out and would hunt for food and get food. And Jacob kind of represented the shepherd, the one who stayed at home, cultivated, the whole idea of cultivation. And this kind of represents a change in civilization, which of course today we don't think too much about because in our modern day world, but this was a huge change in human civilization when we went from being mostly nomadic hunters to becoming now cultivators and people who cultivated both animals and agriculture as well. So we see that kind of difference here. And then, so if you recall, the story is that Esau is very, very hungry, and he comes in, and he's just like, I need some food, I want some food. And Jacob says, well, I'll give you this stew, this pottage, if you will sell me your birthright. And Esau said, well, what good is my birthright if I'm going to die of hunger? Clearly, this is a man of the moment, isn't he? I don't rather doubt he was actually going to die of hunger in that moment, but he was very much a man of the moment. And so he's like, well, what am I going to do if I die of hunger and my birthright doesn't mean anything to me? And so he goes and he sells his birthright to his younger son, his younger brother Jacob, for pottage, and which turns out to actually just be a bunch of red lentils. It wasn't even a good beef stew or anything like that. It was just a bunch of red lentils. So Jacob deceived him even in a second way with what he actually gave him. So we see this deception already in the beginning, starting out with these two brothers, where Jacob tricks his brother into selling him his birthright and tricks him with what he actually gives to him. Then, of course, there's the story of the blessing, of Isaac's blessing. And probably many of us remember that from our Sunday school days. Esau, of course, as the elder brother, was supposed to get the blessing. By this time, Isaac is very old. His sight is very poor. His hearing is very poor. So he has a hard time being able to see and hear and really can't distinguish things very well. Probably had cataracts, but they didn't have laser surgery for cataracts back then, so that wasn't going to help him. But Esau was going to come forward and receive his blessing. And Jacob tells him, go out and hunt and find me some food and make me a wonderful meal. So Esau goes off to go and hunt for food. And of course Rachel, who loves Jacob, because Jacob is her more than Esau, hears about this and goes to Jacob and says, we need to do something about this. So they go and they kill a lamb, dress up the lamb. They put kind of like fake fur, some kind, on Jacob's arm so that he feels hairy, because Esau was a hairy man. So just in case Isaac goes to try to touch him, he'll feel hairy. And Jacob comes into his father Isaac and requests the blessing. Now the story makes for a good story and makes for a wonderful children's story. But listen to this blessing, though. It's in your handout, the first one. Ah, the smell of my son is the smell of a field that the Lord has blessed. May God give you of the dew of heaven and of the fatness of the earth and plenty of grain and wine. Let people serve you and nations bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be everyone who blesses you. In the ancient world, these kinds of blessings were taken very, very seriously. They were considered to have an effect upon real life. That what this blessing was saying would happen would actually happen. And they were taken very, very seriously. So, of course, here Isaac this is an amazing blessing that he's giving to, he thinks, to Esau, but is actually giving it to Jacob. He finds out, however, that he has been deceived and that he's just given this blessing to his younger son rather than to his older son, and he's very upset about that, but he can't do anything about it because he's bound by what he's already done. So you can kind of see almost a fundamental law underneath you. So you think, oh, well, why can't he just do take-backs? You know, we always did take-backs as kids, right? Just going to do a take-back, you know, and then do another blessing on Esau, right? And that certainly is what Esau wanted. But it couldn't happen. That is not the way things work. The blessing had been said, and the blessing stood. But he does, nonetheless, give Esau a blessing. But listen to the difference, though, between these blessings. The second one is on your handout as well. Then his father Isaac, his being Esau, then Esau's father Isaac answered him, "See, away from the fatness of the earth shall be your home be, and away from the dew of heaven on high. By your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother. But when you break loose, you shall break his yoke from your neck." So here, even in this blessing, Isaac is having to admit that the older is going to serve the younger. But something's going to happen, and there's going to be some kind of conflict. And we're going to see that that's going to be important, and Jacob's going to remember that. He's going to remember this as well. Jacob gets scared that his brother is probably going to kill him, probably rightly so, and so he flees his father's house and heads out. And then he starts to head out, and as he's going out, and here all of a sudden we have the intersection of some other material that seems to be from a different tradition, what scholars call the priestly tradition. All of a sudden Rachel is very concerned that Jacob get married from one of their own people and not marry the Canaanites in the land where they currently live, but go back to their homeland and marry one of their own people. So she sends Jacob off to Laban to marry one of Laban's daughters, and Esau stays actually in Canaan and ends up marrying one of the daughters of Ishmael, interestingly enough. So again, we see kind of this difference between the two brothers. On the way from the father's house, Jacob has a meeting at Bethel. Now, initially, this place, Bethel, is no special place in terms, as far as Jacob is concerned, and the narrative is concerned. It's really no special place. But it becomes a holy place, a place that Bethel means actually house of God. Beth is the word for house, and El is the word for God in Hebrew. So Bethel means house of God. And he has this meeting with God. And this is also on your handout on the other page, if you turn your page. And he has a dream. And Genesis 28, it says, "And the Lord stood beside him and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring. And your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east, and to the north and to the south. And all the families of the earth shall be blessed in you and in your offspring. Know that I am with you, and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I've done what I promised you." Quite a covenant that God is making with Jacob at this time. A covenant that he also made with Isaac, and a covenant that he also made with Abraham. So this is a covenant that he's renewing with the family, but quite a covenant. So God also is recognizing Jacob as being the legitimate heir of Isaac, and that the covenant that was started with Abraham and was then passed down to Isaac is now being passed down to Jacob and not to Esau. So God is recognizing that as well by making this covenant with Jacob. But listen to Jacob's response to this it's a pretty amazing covenant that God makes. Then Jacob made a vow saying, "If God will be with me, and if God will keep me in this way that I go, and if God will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace. Then the Lord shall be my God, and this stone which I have set up for a pillar shall be God's house, and of all that you give me I will surely give 1/10 to you. Quite the response, huh? I mean, here God is promising him, inheritance, this whole land and everything. And Jacob's response is, well, if God, you do this, and you do this, and you do this, and you do this, well, then I'll consider maybe that you'll even be my God. And so this is quite the contingent vow that Jacob gives in response to this amazing covenant that God has given. But it's important for us to realize where this is happening, because later on we're going to see Jacob's tune changes quite a bit, and Jacob's attitude toward God changes quite a bit, and the contingency definitely goes away. Then we come into the conflict with Laban. And again, now we have chiasms within chiasms. Isn't this fun? It's fun with chiasms is what this could be called. We have chiasms within chiasms. Those of us who love structure are just enjoying ourselves with this. So the story of Laban, which takes place over many, many years, it takes place, the story between Jacob and Laban. Laban becomes Jacob's father-in-law, and the deception that Laban does has this kind of structure, and you can see that in the handout. It begins with the preliminary meeting, a kiss of meeting, and then there is the meeting with Laban and the contract. Now the contract is that Jacob agrees that he will work for 7 years for Laban's daughter, and he's thinking it's going to be Rachel, because Rachel's the first one that came out to see him and is the one that Jacob falls in love with. But Rachel is the younger daughter, and Leah is the older daughter. And again, of course, older and younger, here we have it again, happens even with daughters in terms of marriage. The older daughter needs to be given away in marriage before the younger daughter can be. And so the initial contract, Jacob thinks, is, well, I will work for you for 7 years, and then you will give me your daughter, Rachel, he thinks. Well, we find out that that will not be the case at all. Then there is the deception of Jacob by Laban, and then there is where Laban tricks Jacob into thinking that he is giving Jacob his daughter Rachel, and instead gives his daughter Leah. And at this time they wore covering. You think, well, how did he not know? Well, that's because the women wore those coverings, and it wasn't until the night of the wedding that he realized that this was not indeed Rachel. This was her sister Leah instead. So then he goes back to Laban. Of course, he's very upset. You tricked me. And they make another agreement. Well, I'll work another 7 years for you, and then I'll get Rachel. And so he does that and ends up marrying Rachel as well. And then they begin to have the birth of the offspring as well. Then we have a trick of Laban by Jacob. And this is with the sheep. And where Jacob has been kind of herding and taking care of Laban's herds, and they've been producing and so forth. And he's kind of getting ready now. He now has his sons, and we'll come back to the offspring in just a moment, because that's an important part of the story as well. We'll come back to that. But he's now got all of his children, and he's kind of getting ready to move on. He's like, I think I've had enough time with father-in-law. It's time for me now to kind of go back to and maybe try to deal with things with Esau. And he wants to, of course, to take provisions to take care of him and his family. And so he tricks his father-in-law, and he says to his father-in-law, all the speckled and spotted sheep I will keep, and you keep all of the rest. And so his father goes in and takes all of the speckled and spotted mothers and fathers out of the herd to make sure no baby speckled and spotted lambs occur. And then there's this very interesting thing, and scholars don't really know what that's all about. It just may be a bit of folklore kind of brought into scripture, where he has strips of wood that are put up by the water trough. And apparently these strips of wood produce speckled and spotted lambs. It reminds me of a myth when I was in college as an undergrad in Peru, and there was a myth that the pink dolphins, and there were pink dolphins, I saw the pink dolphins. They became pink because they got accustomed to the fresh water. But the myth was that an unexpected pregnancy was because a woman had gone down to the water and one of the pink dolphins had done it. And a very convenient myth indeed. So, some myths have their place, and they certainly can help explain some things. So here we have these pieces of wood and end up creating all these speckled and spotted sheep. And basically what it means is that Jacob ends up becoming quite wealthy at the expense of his father-in-law Laban. And he ends up having all of these herds. And so this is the deception, this is the trick of Laban by Jacob. Then they go, and he ends up leaving and decides that he's going to leave. And then they make a covenant not to harm each other or anything, and then there's the departure. So that's kind of the chiastic structure between the conflict with Laban, between Jacob and Laban. Some of the recurring motifs, I think, that are important in this, and one of them you got right away, which is it's meant to be humorous. I mean, this whole story between Jacob and Laban, I mean, if you don't read it and laugh, you've missed the point. It is meant to be humorous. It's meant to be these two tricksters, they're both tricksters, getting themselves all caught up in their web of lies and deception and trying to get themselves uncaught from it all, and how they end up tricking each other. And again, this just goes back to saying Scripture has an earthiness to it. It has a groundedness to it that sometimes we forget if we put it up on this pedestal. And particularly if we only hear Scripture when it's being read on Sunday, which is of course an important time to hear Scripture. But if we only hear Scripture at that time, it's sometimes hard for us to hear that humor that's there. And that's really about reading it on our own. Also, again, we see that Jacob is a man of conflicts. The conflicts continue. The conflict with his brother, which we will see will end up getting resolved. And then now we have the conflict with Laban, which is kind of a story within the story. So we have the conflict with Esau. You can almost imagine this as a soap opera, right? Week to week, what's going to happen? And the conflict with Esau has kind of been put on hold for a minute. And now we have kind of this subplot that has been stuck into the story between Jacob and Laban. And initially it starts out with this conflict, but in the end, they reconcile with each other. And they make a covenant that they will honor each other and that Jacob will take care of Laban's daughters and Laban will not try to kill Jacob. That's a good covenant to make. So Jacob heads on out, and he is now ready to go, and he is very concerned because he knows he's going to meet up with his brother Esau. And this is a prayer that Jacob makes about, actually before we get to that piece, I wanted to talk about the births. I said we would talk about the births, and let me dial back just a moment and talk about the births, because the births are actually the center of all of this. And again, this is where we then get the tribes of Jacob. So we have first Leah bears Reuben and Simeon and Judah. Rachel gets upset because her older sister is having all of these children, and Rachel is barren. How often do we hear this in Scripture? How often do we hear this particular narrative in Scripture? Starting with Sarah, we can think about Elizabeth in the New Testament, and Luke, this narrative of a woman desiring to have children and unable to do so. And so Rachel's remedy, which our modern day ears may not like to hear, but nonetheless it is what she does, is to give her handmaiden Bilhah to her husband. And Bilhah then bears two sons, Dan and Naphtali. Then Leah gets upset because now Rachel, through her surrogate, is having children. And Leah has stopped having children. So Leah then gives her handmaid, Zilpah, to Jacob. And Zilpah bears Gad and Asher. And then Leah is once again able to bear children. She bears Issachar, Zebulun, and their daughter Dinah, the only daughter that's mentioned anyway. And then finally Rachel bears Joseph at this point. And later on, Rachel will also bear Benjamin, who are most beloved of Jacob. So those births are really the births of the tribes of Israel, because the tribes of Israel will then be known under those names, and those are kind of the primal fathers, if you will, of what will become the tribes of Israel eventually. So now, going back to Jacob is leaving Laban. He's back on his way, and he's concerned about meeting up with his brother. And listen to this prayer that Jacob gives. It's right after the chiastic structure on your handout. This is actually the only extended prayer in Genesis. It's the prayer of Jacob. It's there are short prayers that are mentioned, but the only extended prayer that's found in the book of Genesis. And Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, now right off the bat we have a very different tone here, don't we? Remember the contingent vow and this would have been a few decades back, and we've gone through this in about 5 minutes, but this would have been decades in the back. But if you'll do this, and if you'll do this, and if you'll do this, then you'll be my God. Right off the bat, Jacob is saying to God, O God of my father Abraham. Remember that? You made a promise to my father Abraham, grandfather actually. And O God of my father Isaac. Remember that? He's kind of trying to remind God. Remember those promises, those covenants you made to them. O Lord, who said to me, return to your country and to your kindred, and I will do you good. I am not worthy of the least of all the steadfast love. Chesed is the Hebrew there. We hear a lot about steadfast love in the Old Testament, God's love toward Israel. I'm not worthy of the least of all the chesed, the steadfast love, and all the faithfulness that you have shown to your servant. With only my staff I crossed this Jordan, and now I have become 2 companies. He's so big he's had to split into 2 groups. Deliver me, please, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I am afraid of him. He may come and kill us all, the mothers with the children. Yet you have said, I will surely do you good and make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted because of their number. He's reminding God of that covenant that God made so many years ago with him. Quite a different prayer. Quite a different attitude that we have here. Then we have the amazing story of the meeting at Penuel, which again is kind of a mirror of the meeting at Bethel. And this is where Jacob meets the man, simply described as the man. We don't really know who the man is. Scholars, is it God? Is it an angel of the Lord that Jacob meets? Is it a demon? Is it some other kind of deity? We don't know. We really don't know what it is. It's just the story simply says that it's the man. And they begin to wrestle, and they wrestle all night. And as the night is ending and the dawn is coming, the man says to Jacob, then he said, let me go, for the day is breaking. But Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. I love this. I love this. Just as a side note, this is my own personal hermeneutic for Scripture, right here. I will not let you go unless you bless me. There's a passage in Scripture. This is not really has anything to do with the story itself. I'm just giving you a little aside here for a moment. But if there's a passage in Scripture that you just are having the hardest time understanding, wrestle with it. Wrestle with it and say, I am not going to let you go until you bless me with the understanding, the insight that I'm looking for. It's a wonderful, wonderful motivation here. So he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. Then the man said, you shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. For you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So here we have a new name is given to Jacob. He's no longer the supplanter. He's no longer the heel. And now he's given the name of Israel, which could mean God protects, God preserves, God rules in some way that. Brueggemann says here, that is how Israel comes on the horizon. Israel now meaning the nation Israel, or the people Israel, really. That is how Israel as a people comes on the horizon. Israel is not formed by success or shrewdness or land, but by an assault from God. Perhaps it is grace, but not the kind of grace usually imagined. Because Israel now receives a limp, which is going to be something that he's going to keep with him. Again, Brueggemann says, this narrative reflects some of Israel's most sophisticated theology. On the one hand, Jacob Israel soars to bold heights of a Promethean kind in actually wrestling with God. But then he is corrected by a limp, affirming that only God is God. On the other hand, Jacob is a cripple with a blessing. Israel must ponder how it is that blessings are given and at what cost. This same theology of weakness in power and power in weakness turns this text toward the New Testament and the gospel of the cross. You can see that Christ talked about that. First being last and the last being first. Then we finally have the reconciliation. Jacob meets Esau and they meet face to face. And this, I think, is just really pretty amazing. And again, I give all credit to all of this to Brueggemann, but again, this is just a really amazing insight that I think that Brueggemann found here. In looking at that meeting at Penuel, where Jacob says, "I saw the face of God," and then now meeting his brother Esau, and connecting those two stories together, that there's a reconciliation that Jacob has with God, and then a reconciliation that he has with his brother in terms of face. Penuel means face. Pen is face. El is God, face of God. So in 32:20, it says, "Afterwards I, Jacob," this is pre-Israel, Jacob, "afterwards I, Jacob, shall see his, Esau's face." Then 32:30, this is Penuel. "For I, Jacob, Israel, have seen God's face to face, seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved." And then in 33, after the meeting, "For truly to see your, Esau, his brother, the man he's had conflict with from the womb, to see your face is like seeing the face of God." Here we go all the way back around. Man whose life is filled with conflict from the very womb, finally, the end, is reconciled with his brother. Thank you very much.